that's going to protect. So there's this outer layer called dura mater, and dura means tough. So actually, and mater, or mater, however you want to pronounce it, means mother. So it's a tough mother, is what it's really called. And it's the thickness and texture. If you guys have like a brown paper bag that you get from the grocery store and you make it wet so it's bendy, it's really like that thick. It's a lot more, it's pretty durable. So that's going to be the outer shell layer around the spinal cord. Just under it is a spider web-like fibrous layer called arachnoid mater, which arachnoid gives you the spider web-like. So it means actually this is where fluid is going to travel through. And we're going to learn a little more about the fluid a little later, and even more about the fluid when we do Unit 3 with the brain. So at this point, you have this outer, real thick, tough dura mater, that's the outer protective layer. You have just under that a spider web-like, more like scaffolding, fibrous tissue that fluid's going to run through. There's cerebral spinal fluid will run through here. And then you have pia mater, which is this delicate, thin layer. I like to think of it as just like a Vaseline layer on the surface of the spinal cord. Like it's just more of a thin, slimy layer directly touching the spinal cord and brain. So you essentially have this slimy layer, the pia, touching the surface. Then you have arachnoid, which is more fibrous, that fluid's going to run through. And then this outer shell, a little thicker, but still flexible, of dura. So those are the three layers, and you can see them kind of depicted here in this image. So the pia is on the surface. The arachnoid is this, they make it translucent in this picture. So that's because it's fibrous and more scaffolding for fluid to go through. And then the dura is not penetrable by fluid, so we'll also contain it there. So what is cerebral spinal fluid? So I have fluid, basic. All you need to know that there is cerebral spinal fluid. It is the fluid, it's clear, and it's made in the brain. And it literally, and the details of this will be more forthcoming in the unit where we cover the brain specifically. You just need to know it's made in the brain. It then travels through these little tunnels through the brain and down the spinal cord in this tiny hole in the center of the spinal cord, and we'll get to this part, but it's called the central canal. And so this picture here you can see where they're just showing it and they segmented the spinal cord, but it goes straight down the center of the spinal cord to the very end, out the very end of the spinal cord, which ends up being this sort of narrow stump that comes to a point, and then it spills out, and then it comes back up, actually the outside of the spinal cord to the outside of the brain, and it's reabsorbed there. So for our purposes, we're really just going to know it's traveling down this tunnel in the middle of the spinal cord, if you were to cut it in half, and then it's also coming back up, and we know now from the coverings, it's going to come up through the arachnoid mater up on the outside so it can get reabsorbed at the top of the brain. It's made inside the brain, goes down, comes back around, and is reabsorbed at the top of the brain. So we actually have a little current of cerebral spinal fluid flowing through us. So here's the image where we can see in the middle, in the core center part of the brain is where it's being made. It's by these little red areas that we're going to learn later that are the choroid plexus. And then it travels down this hole in the center of the spinal cord, gets to the bottom, and then you can see the arrows coming back up. And so when it comes back up to the brain, it gets reabsorbed. So the spaces that the fluid is going to travel on the outside of the spinal cord coming back up to the brain, we have an epidural space, we have a subdural space, and a subarachnoid space. So we'll go through each of these. This top picture here, you can see they're showing you the scalp. There's the skin, and then under the scalp, obviously, then there's the skull. So that's the yellow in that picture. We see the skull. So the layers that we're talking about here, the first layer is the blue. That's the dura. And then you can see in the gray right here, that's the arachnoid. So you can see how it's kind of lifted, it's kind of scaffolding. So fluid would run through the arachnoid. And then the pink here on the surface of the brain is the pia. Here's an expanded view where you would have brain matter, blood vessels going down into the brain. So pia is sort of like this orange that's just really touching it. But this here is arachnoid, so it's got spaces where fluid's going to go. Many of you guys are familiar with the term getting an epidural if someone's going to give birth or something. So that's where you're actually applying some anesthetic, but you're not really going into the cerebral spinal fluid. It's going to be further out, outside of the dura, and all that's going to do is lessen sensory input. Remember, the afferent neurons are going back up to the brain. It's going to reduce their ability to send information. So the person going through the procedure is going to have less perception of pain during that procedure. But usually an epidural really just means outside of the dura. So it's a lot more superficial, where you're really not getting into there as much, but you're still lessening the sensations. The subdural space is under the dura but above the arachnoid mater. And then you have the subarachnoid space that's going to be within here that you're going to have actual cerebral spinal fluid. So if somebody has to get a spinal tap and you're worried about meningitis or some other problems within there, you have to tap into this subarachnoid space to actually extract some of this cerebral spinal fluid there. When we look at a spinal cord, this is what a spinal cord looks like. If we were to chop someone across on a transverse slice, and we see spinal cord, it has this butterfly pattern in it. So, and we're going to learn the details of this. So you're definitely going to want to learn how to draw a circle, an oval. You're going to draw this butterfly pattern because we're going to learn a bunch of different regions, and we're going to learn about but the point in this particular picture is all the blue going around it is the subarachnoid space, where the green around here is the dura. So you don't worry about the subdural cavity. So we're just going to know, say the dura is actually the black above the green. And then the blue line here is going to be the arachnoid, but it's all scaffolding. So you can see it's fibrous, it's going to hold it out, but it's within there that blue is the cerebral spinal fluid. So it's going to be around the outside. The hole that I said it comes down the center, they didn't do a very good drawing it, but it's going to be right here in the middle. They just made it as a dot. That's the central canal. So that's where it goes down the spinal cord through that canal, reaches the bottom, and then it's coming back up the outside through this area here. So the whole spinal cord, now we just know there's fluid down the center, there's fluid on the outside. On the outside, it's in the subarachnoid space because it's in the scaffolding there. The whole spinal cord is really not as long as you think it is. It's only about 1.5 feet long. It's about 1/2 inch wide. I'll show you a spinal cord in a little while. I have one in a container in the other room. But the actual spinal cord ends about L1, L2. So that's not very far below your last rib. So it's around, like if you were to put your hands on your hips and where your thumb would be behind you. It's around that area. That the spinal cord proper, it's not the nerve's end. It ends here, known as a conus medullaris. But along the spinal cord, if you were to take the whole thing out, there are some enlargements. You're going to have a wider area up here in the cervical region because we have a whole lot of nerves that are going to be coming off of there. So there's a lot of information that needs to come off of this cervical region that's going to go to and control our arms. Then the thoracic cavity, there's really just a few nerves coming off each segment, nothing any big. So it doesn't have to be extra large, the spinal cord. So it gets narrower down through the thoracic region. And then the lower bottom in the lumbar region, which is the lower back, then that's where you see a little enlargement, another enlargement. That's because all these nerves are now having to come off to control your pelvis and your legs. So these areas where we have more nerves that are sprout to handle our limbs are going to have some enlargements on the spinal cord to handle more cell bodies and neurons within there. So the 3 regions of the spinal cord are cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral is the very bottom. Our cervical nerves, you have not yet learned about the cervical vertebrae. So some of the terminology will cross over when we learn about the vertebrae. But you have the cervical region, which is going to be your neck region. Here we have 8 nerves coming off, and they are known as spinal nerves. So this model that we have, the yellow things that are protruding represent the spinal nerves coming off. So you have a whole bunch of little roots that are going to be off of the spinal cord itself. But then when they finally make their way past the vertebral bony part, the vertebral column, they're spinal nerves. In the cervical region, we have 8 spinal nerves. However, later you're going to learn there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, because they start the counting as number 1 above the first, and then you go down to 7, and then they finish counting your last cervical spinal nerve below the 7th. So that's why how they ended up adding an extra one. But since we haven't learned that there's only 7 bones, at this point just know there are 8 pairs, because there's 1 on each side, of cervical vertebrae. We also have 12 pairs. We have 12 pairs of thoracic spine. And then we have 5 pairs of lumbar nerves coming down. And then we have 5 pairs of sacral nerves. The sacrum is going to be here as the back part of your pelvis. Again, we haven't done the bony structure yet to give you some perspective on that. So you will need to know, I will ask you, how many nerves are coming off cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral? Some people like to think of it as the day, like, so you can do like 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, and 5 sacral. So some people think of it as breakfast at 8 o'clock, lunch at 12 o'clock, and dinner at 5 o'clock. Conus medullaris is actually the end of the spinal cord. It's right here. So the end of the spinal cord is right here, like I said, is around L1 to L2. And this is where the spinal cord is a solid mass, and then it tapers down to a point. And below that becomes the cauda equina. So the area that's in the red now, you can see is the cauda equina. And this is known as the horse's tail. That's what the word means. And if you, I'm going to remove these here. If you can see the end of the spinal cord, it is a lot like a horse's tail. Anybody out there have horses and you brush the tail, you'll know that coming down their tail can be quite long. The hair on the tail can be quite long, but coming off of their body, the tail's really only, this long, and you can feel it as a solid mass, and it tapers down, and then the hairs come right off of it. The end of the spinal cord is almost exactly like that. You have a solid mass of the spinal cord, but it tapers and ends. That would be the conus medullaris, where it ends between L1 and L2. But then nerves will continue out and down, still within the containment of the vertebral column. And so you have this cauda equina, where you have all these stringy, that would be like the hairs of the horse's tail, but they're just stringy nerves coming down through there. This picture is an actual spinal cord. So you can see the number 1 showing you kind of this where the spinal cord's tapering down, and 2 are all the stringy nerves just kind of hanging out. So if you're going to do a lumbar puncture, this is more like your clinical application side of things, you're going to want to insert a needle, because if we want to get that cerebral spinal fluid that we want to, what if we were worried somebody has meningitis, some sort of bacteria that's from within the brain? The cerebral spinal fluid is going to go down that central canal, and it comes out at the point of the conus medullaris. All through here, cerebral spinal fluid is freely floating with the stringy nerves. So if you're going to do a spinal tap and you're going to take a needle and you're going to go through, you actually end up asking the patient to bend forward. Might not bend that far, but as they bend forward, you can see how the spinous processes, the patient will end up bending forward, and the spinous processes that we have yet to know, which is the pointy part of the vertebral column, they will spread apart a little. So the doctor will know by counting down exactly, okay, L1 and L2 is probably the end of the thickest part of the spinal cord. So we're going to head down to like 4 and 5. We're going to get way lower, so we know we're definitely in the clear of the thicker mass of the spinal cord. So we're going to get way further down here, like rip this guy's spinal cord out, and then you're going to end up, they'll put a needle straight through, and then they're going to take the needle. And you're going to try to get cerebral spinal fluid, or are you going to stay outside of the dura, or are you going to go under the dura, or are you going to go under the arachnoid? Outside the dura. So for the cerebral spinal fluid, it's going to be within the arachnoid space. Because remember, that's where, if you are going to be within this part. But and that's if you are within the spinal cord masses. The good news is, if you get down to the cauda equina area, you can actually go through, and yes, there's nerves, and you don't move from side to side. So if someone goes further down, you're still in the subarachnoid space, but it's more free and loose, more or less confined, that you could stick a needle through here and actually be able to pull in some fluid and less likely to damage nerves by doing it that way. So a lumbar puncture is what that is called. That's where you're going to go. So you want to be here in this subarachnoid space in order to sample enough cerebral spinal fluid. This is just a closer up view of them accessing that within there. So the spinal roots become spinal nerves. So the spinal nerve is what has already left the confines of the vertebral column. That's what's going out to the body. The roots are these tiny little nerves coming off the spinal cord directly. So we're going to go down to there. But outside of the body, the big nerves that we would see in the cadaver moving along here, those are known as spinal nerves. And this is the number of them. So I will probably ask you, how many spinal nerves in the cervical region, thoracic, and lumbar and sacral. The roots that these spinal nerves, so if I circle this here, this is a spinal nerve here where it's coming away. This is remove the skeletal component. So we don't have the vertebral column around it. So this portion is what's actually going to be going out, and that's a spinal nerve. A different color. The roots themselves, though, are these little guys that are actually coming off of the spinal cord. So a section of spinal cord that really is sort of between where these roots are, all have little hair-like fibers coming off that all just sort of get bundled together to come out as a spinal nerve. So as we dive down and we're going to look at the specific anatomy of a spinal cord, know that there's these tiny little roots that then come together and to become a nerve that comes out here. So again, I wanted you to have that perspective of terminology. What's the difference between a spinal nerve versus a spinal root? You can also think of them as an on-off system for a highway. Do you guys remember the types of neurons? Sensory versus motor, and the other names we had for sensory and motor?
Efferent and afferent.
Yes, so what would an efferent one be?
Motor, right?
Efferent is motor. So I'm going to put here.
And then afferent sensory.
So a motor nerve is coming from the brain going out. So what happens is we're going to draw coming from the brain. So if we say brain way up here, here's the brain, really bad, obviously depiction of the spinal cord, and you have, say, a cell body coming down. It's going to terminate there. And we're going to have a cell body, our motor neuron right there, with its axon coming out this side. Make this a little darker. And this is going to then head out to the axon terminal, and then I'm just going to write at the end of muscle where it might be going to. And that's your little synapse. You guys sort of good with this really new connection. The dorsal root is known as afferent or sensory. Sensory means maybe we had dendrites out here, dendrites, that would be, say, on your fingertips, that you touch something you're getting sensory information from. So we might just say, I'll just write touch receptors or something. It's going to have an axon that's going to come back into the spinal nerve, goes to the posterior side of the spinal cord, into the spinal cord, and it's going to have its little axon terminal there. And then when you touch something, in order for your brain to know about it, it sends it to a cell body that's going to go up to the brain and say, hey, we just touched something slimy, you know, or whatever information is going back. The point that I want you to gather from this bad drawings that I've done in these terms is the nerve roots will be very specific. It's either motor going out, it's going to be on the front side of the spinal cord, or it's sensory coming in, which is going to be on the back side of the spinal cord. But the spinal nerves that are coming out that we see here are a mixture of both. So these are known as mixed nerves. Here's a couple more pictures to really highlight this, where we have our spinal roots, which are all the little guys coming off the spinal cord themselves, over here and over here. So those would be the roots, where the spinal nerves are way out here after they've, that's these guys coming way out here, or these ones out here. That's just going out to the body because then they're mixed. Do you guys remember the difference between white matter and gray matter? So our gray matter is where the synapse is going to take place. So let me draw a neuron. We have a couple of neurons here. Let's say we have within the brain, here's a cell body, axon terminal. We know we're going to have neurotransmitters here. And say we're going to then connect to another cell body, and we're going to go out to a muscle or wherever. Actually, it's going to do a different thing. We're going to go. What I have here are 3 neurons. We have a neuron in the part of the brain here, and there's going to be a synapse to a second neuron. And then that's going to bring information, say, down the spinal cord, synapse to another neuron that's going to bring it out of the spinal cord. So that's the example that we might have here. The areas of gray matter are going to be the areas where the synapses are going to take place. So in gray matter, the parts of the neuron that we're going to find are first the end of the first neuron. That would be axon terminals. So we'll say axon terminals with neurotransmitters. We're also going to have the dendrites and cell bodies of the second neuron or the receiving neuron. And that's pretty much what you need to know is in gray matter. White matter would then contain what?
Myelinated and unmyelinated axons.
Yep. So we would have white matter is going to be the axons. In the spinal cord, this is what an actual slice of a spinal cord looks like. We're going to know all of these parts, but I want you to identify that we definitely have this butterfly area in the middle, and that's going to be our gray matter. So that's where these connections are going to take place. Prior to diving into the gray matter and the white matter and the nerves, we're just going to name some basic parts and regions of the spinal cord at this point. The anterior median fissure is this portion. In this picture, you don't notice it as much, but it actually, because it's a little mushed together, but the spinal cord comes around and it will actually dive in there a little bit. It's just sort of mushed together. So you see this, a fissure is a cut or a line or break in something, like a separation. And it's in the middle, so it's named for its location, anterior median fissure. The central canal is a tiny little hole in the middle. Do we remember what's in the central canal? Cerebral spinal fluid is in the central canal. Know that. The posterior horn is this posterior side. It will be the pointy side. I always like to think posterior pointy. So notice on this butterfly pattern, I'll undo the arrow so you can see it better. We can see one portion is real pointy. Oops, see how it's like more pointy here, and then it's really round here. So the posterior horn is going to be on the posterior side, and it's a little more pointy. And then we have the anterior horn. It's going to be the anterior side, and it's more rounded in appearance. So that's going to be your best way to determine which orientation of your spinal cord. On your practical exam, you will get a picture of a spinal cord, and you will have. The lateral horn in this particular picture is not really that obvious, but it's more on the motor side, more on the anterior side, but it ends up being kind of this shoulder area. Some areas it actually jogs out and then goes around, and you have this extra little hump, not in this particular area. So this sort of region within here is known as the lateral horn. Do you recall which type of neuron on the anterior side? Motor or sensory? Motor. So we would have here dendrites and cell body, and then the axon is coming off and going to go out. So that's our motor or efferent neuron. It came from the gray matter. That's what's circled in blue. We have the cell body here, the same as that cell body there. And then with the axon that's coming off, it then goes out to the body there. And then you could have the same thing on the other side. Here's the cell body axon, and it's going to go out to the body over there. So you're going to control that side of the body or the other side. The anterior horn will have cell bodies and dendrites of motor neurons. The lateral horn really have cell bodies and dendrites of, we haven't heard this term yet, autonomic neurons. Does anyone know what that means? Sort of close to automatic. So if the motor neurons are going to go to a muscle because I wanted to move my muscle, that's a voluntary impulse. But what if I'm trying to digest food? I'm not sitting there going, okay, stomach, do your job. That's an autonomic response. So actually those types of things, they're coming from the lateral horn. So it's still going out to your body to tell it to do something. It's just not in the conscious realm of your. The gray commissure is just the connection between the two sides. Tracts just means bundles of axons that are being sent to similar places. So if we're bundling up a whole bunch of information to come up to the brain, that's going to be in one track along the spinal cord. That would be ascending and going up. Descending is bringing some sort of motor. So they're going to bundle in our spinal cord. All the autonomic stuff is kind of probably going to travel together. The motor stuff is going to travel also in these various tracks. So if you just hear the word track, it just means groups of axons. So the nerve roots are what's coming directly off the spinal cord itself, that you have the motor ones on the front and the sensory ones on the back. Those are the roots. Let me go back here. This would be one of the roots, and then up here is the other root. And then over here, after they've come together, they're the nerve. The dorsal root is sensory. So that's information coming to, so it's afferent, it's coming back in, but it's going to come in towards the back side. So then we have an extra thing that's known as the dorsal root ganglia. So we're going to have to do a little backtracking into nerve anatomy to figure out what's going on with the ganglia. So here's our nerve backtracking. Sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. I have drawn motor neurons here. The motor neurons are the neurons that we're talking about all the time. I draw cell body dendrites on one side, put the nucleus in, draw the axons, and then you have an axon terminal. That's pretty much our standard everyday motor neuron. Sensory neurons don't look like that. So sensory neurons are a little funky looking. That's what a sensory neuron looks like. Its cell body is just kind of shoved off in this weird cul-de-sac off the side of the nerve. Where we had the motor, this is the one we're used to seeing, right? So this is, we're familiar with motor, but the key to what we're going to do some more spinal cord anatomy has to do with the funky shape of this sensory neuron. So on this sensory neuron, I'm just going to give you dendrites are going to be here. So the impulse is going to go from, sensing something here, let's say touch or temperature or whatever sensing we're getting. That's the dendrites receiving this information in. The information is going to go straight this way. And then it's over at these guys. I'm just going to draw axon terminals on here where the neurotransmitters are. So this is an axon, and these guys here are axon terminals with neurotransmitters. And so this funky little thing off to the side is just the cell body. Sensory neurons. These out here are going to be the dendrites. They're going to be by the sensory receptors. And then we have the axon, bringing it back into the spinal cord. So we were at the spinal nerve point up until now. Now we're switching out, once it's divided and separated the motor versus sensory, we're now into territory. So we're in the roots. It keeps coming past here. And then these guys there, all collectively, the axon terminal with neurotransmitters. So it's going to be in the gray matter where a synapse is going to take place. Be comfortable with that. Then we have these funky little things here. This cell body for that sensory neuron, they're actually just held outside the spinal cord in this wide area. So look at the image and see how it just has this wide area that the motor side doesn't have. That's because loads and loads of sensory neuron cell bodies are just clustered there outside of the spinal cord. So we can see the diagram here where we have the dendrites, which would be out here. The axon is going to be this blue drawing there. The axon terminals are going to be found within here, within the spinal cord, in the posterior horn. And then the cell body that's over here is going to be found right in here. And that area is known as the dorsal root ganglia. So the dendrites are going to receive the stimulus, touch, sight, too hot, whatever, felt something slimy. The axon is going to bring the impulse towards the spinal cord. And then at the very end, we have the axon terminals. They're going to release neurotransmitters onto a nerve that's going to then go up to the brain and say, hey, we touched something slimy. The cell body of the sensory neuron is found together in the dorsal root ganglia. So the motor side of things, this is our motor neuron that we're used to seeing. We can see there's the dendrites within the anterior horn. It's the rounded part of the gray matter in the spinal cord. The cell body's there too. Now when it sends its efferent or motor impulse out and off of the spinal cord, going to go down the axon, you can see it coming out of the spinal cord and out until you get to the end, which is the axon terminal, that's going to go to someplace like the muscle. It could go to a gland. It could go anywhere else. It could go to your stomach if it's from the lateral horn part. And so now you know what these big fat parts are. This wide area is now known as the what? Dorsal root ganglia, exactly. So the white matter, in this case, is white, is lightly stained. The gray matter, which is going to have our cell bodies and dendrites, is going to be our dark stained area. The dorsal root, remember that's on the posterior side, dorsal, it's going to have our axons for sensory nerves, and you can see at the end of the axons I drew little circles. Those would be the axon terminals that have neurotransmitters. The ventral root have the axons of motor nerves. So these are axons of the motor nerves. The red circled area is going to be our dorsal root ganglia, and that's the sensory neurons cell body. So I wanted to at least match the yellow being motor, the red being sensory. So the neuron anatomy that you need to know are white matter and gray matter. I'm going to ask you what's in white matter. You're going to say axons. What's in gray matter? I'm going to say axon terminals, cell bodies, dendrites, where that synapse is going to take place. Then posterior gray horn, I'll say what's located within there, and you'll say the axon terminals of sensory neurons. Anterior gray horn will be cell bodies and dendrites of motor neurons. So if you overlay a cross section of a spinal cord after you've just named the regions, then overlay it with the nerve anatomy. So you would want to draw, if I do the color we had on the last, cell bodies, dendrites, that would be our anterior gray horn. And if we did our ventral roots coming out, that would be this bottom one here, right? So if you want to color code that, if I were to do in red, cell bodies, I'm just going to do a solid, and axon terminals. So we would have the dorsal root ganglia here, sensory neuron cell bodies. We would then have the posterior gray horn is our sensory neuron axon terminals, or the end of the sensory neuron. Our dorsal root is going to be right here, and that's our sensory axons. They're coming into the spinal cord there. Okay, so this is a list of what you should know where the body parts, if you want to think of it as far as a nerve anatomy body part, where they'll be found. So you should know the spinal cord anatomy, but also what parts of a neuron is going to be where. So what you should know for what we've just done, the three meninges, dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. The spaces between the meninges, most importantly, the subarachnoid space is where you're going to find cerebral spinal fluid. The distal cord is going to be the conus medullaris going to the cauda equina. So a lot of squiggly nerves hanging off there that if you were to do a spinal tap, it's just going to hit the individual nerves and actually not puncture them. They'll just move aside. So it's easier to actually get a sample of cerebral spinal fluid in the cauda equina region. So you should know that the conus medullaris, or the end of the spinal cord, is about L1 or L2. So anytime you go below that, then you're going to be safer to extract cerebral spinal fluid. The spinal cord cross-sectional anatomy is what part, so not only do you need to know dorsal roots, ventral roots, and spinal nerves, but you need to know the posterior horn and anterior horn, gray commissure, central canal, anterior median fissure. So those are the parts. And there's a lateral horn. And then you should know the neuron anatomy. So if I were to say what's found in the dorsal root ganglia, in your mind, you'd say cell bodies, sensory neurons. What's in the anterior horn? Cell bodies, motor neurons or dendrites. What's in the posterior horn? That's the end of the sensory, so axon terminals of sensory neurons. So I want you to know the parts of the nerves that's going to be found in each of these regions.